13 of the fantasy football season. And here's a few defense DST units I would drop this week. The first one, the Chicago Bears. So the Bears here had a great matchup at the Detroit Lions on paper. And they got added in 55% of fantasy leagues going into week 12. But in that ball game, they just didn't perform really at an elite level for a defense versus a terrible offense. So in that game, 14 points allowed, a sack, and a fumble recovery. So the Bears here, they've pretty much been a mediocre defense this season. And now in week 13, you're not going to use them versus the Arizona Cardinals. They're one of the best offenses in all of pro football. And you're not going to use them in week 14 as well at the Packers. So with two tough matchups coming up and an underwhelming performance versus the Detroit Lions, they're an easy defense to drop this week here is the Bears. The next defense I would look to drop is the Houston Texans. I mentioned the Texans as a 1 week ad on the waiver wire last week here. And they didn't get the job done as well here with a great matchup versus the Jets that give up the second most fantasy points to defenses on the year. 21 points allowed, 4 sacks, and an interception. So they were added in 51% of fantasy leagues. But now they could be dropped easily here is the Texans. Week 13, a tough matchup versus Indianapolis that has a pretty solid offense. In week 14, I know they versus Seattle, who's been struggling this season, but I still wouldn't trust Houston in that situation versus a Seattle team that could break out at any time, in my opinion. Russell Wilson, he's getting healthier. He's still got 2 great receivers, obviously, in DK Metcalf and Lockett, and I think that offense could get going. So right here, Texans, they're not going to be usable until week 15 at Jacksonville. But right now, there's no reason to hold on to them after they didn't put up a good performance versus the Jets. And the third and final defense I would drop this week is the Carolina Panthers. So the Panthers go on bye here in week 13. And I thought they would have a great ball game versus Miami that gave up the 7th most fantasy points to defenses in week 12. But in that one, they got blown out and they gave up 33 points, 2 sacks, and a fumble recovery. So they didn't show up in that game. And this season, their defense has been hit or miss, but right now they've been missing over the last few weeks. I know week 14, they got a good matchup versus Atlanta. Maybe they could be usable there as Carolina, but with the bye coming up and a bad performance at Miami, they're an easy defense to drop this week. So that's a few defenses I would drop here in week 13 of the fantasy football season.